We're going to go ahead and get started. So just really quickly, my name is Chris Nielsen. I'm with the California Nurses Association, National Nurses United. We're co-sponsoring this event along with the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine and the larger series that it's a part of, Social Medicine for Our Times. So in just a second, I'll turn the time over to Charles Briggs, co-director of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine, who will present our fantastic panel for tonight. But just really quickly, I just wanted to give you a brief idea of who we are, the National Nurses United, and why we're doing this, why we're working with the Center for Social Medicine on this. So National Nurses United is the largest nurses union in the country with over 150,000 members and growing. And one of the reasons that we are growing, unlike some unions in the United States right now, is that I think our mission and our work aligns very well with the values and the work of our members. You know, nurses generally approach health and healthcare in a very holistic way and understand that their care and their advocacy for their patients can't end at the bedside. That if they want to, be truly effective advocates for their patients, they're going to have to try to address the underlying causes of their illnesses and their suffering. And that's what we try to do as an organization as well. We take that similar philosophy to our work. That's why we are so involved in various social movements, first and foremost with the movement for Medicare for all in this country. But it's why we're involved in movements for racial justice, environmental justice, some of the topics that we've already actually covered in this series up to this point. And we're really excited to hear the topic tonight, toward health and environmental justice. So we do that work, like I said, by being involved in social movement building, and we see social movement building as a form of healthcare. To paraphrase Rudolf Virchow, his famous phrase that medicine and nursing too is a social science, and that politics is nothing but healthcare, nursing, medicine on a large scale. And we do the work I told you about. We're also very involved in various education projects, this being one of them. We do continuing education on the social and structural determinants of health for our members. We do popular political education on similar topics for activists and allies and community members. We do different types of higher education initiatives where we partner with different universities, where our nurses can take courses on these types of topics with students at those universities, and this is one of those types of spaces that we're trying to create, a space for scholars, activists, healthcare professionals, community members to come together and learn about these kinds of topics, and more importantly, think and strategize about ways to actually intervene, make structural interventions, social interventions, trying to address those social determinants of health. And so with that, I'll just leave it there and turn it over to Charles Briggs to present our fantastic panel for tonight.
Well, thanks very much. I suppose I'm not supposed to talk until I get over here on camera. It has been such a pleasure to be able to share now 4 events with National Nurses United, the California Nurses Association, and the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine, which forms part of the ISSI over here at Berkeley. I thank particularly Adrian Pine, who's been wonderful over the course of this time, Carlos Martinez, who's done so much work to get all of these events going, as Seth Holmes, as the co-director of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. And I want to begin under the spirit of full disclosure with a confession. I'm a barefoot nurse. All right, get that? You have barefoot doctors, but how about a barefoot nurse? See, I often work in the rainforest, even during times of epidemics of cholera and whatnot, with a physician, Dr. Clara Montini-Briggs. When we can get a real nurse, we obviously bring along a nurse. Sometimes back in the rainforest where no health professional had ever been before, this sounds like Star Wars, there was no nurse, and so she had to recruit the nearest person who might be able to serve that. So sometimes we had to together see up to 120 patients a day. I know I'm the world's worst nurse, but I'll tell you, I tried real hard. So it's wonderful to be with people who actually know what they're doing and for whom this is their lifelong profession. Now, I think we could almost say that the United States discovered health disparities in 2002. all of a sudden there's a wake-up call from the CDC saying, surprise, disease burdens and health outcomes are tremendously different across racial groups, including particularly looking at African Americans and Latinx populations. Then in April, the Institute of Medicine said, my goodness, look at this, systematically controlling for type of health insurance and for socioeconomic status. African Americans and Latinx, Latinas get worse health care. Right? Wow, what a great discovery. And this is very important. It spawned a lot of debates. And it also shows two tremendous forms of ignorance and disappearance. One is, the predominance of individualistic, mechanistic, and mercantilistic ways of thinking about medicine and public health that would make this such a discovery, right, as the evidence continued over such a long period of time. And also over the systematic delegitimization of other ways of thinking about health. And I don't just mean complementary and alternative medicine here, I mean critical perspectives like those of the Panthers, for example, on biomedicine. But the second one is the imperialistic silence that precludes awareness of a debate that has been taking place in Latin America at least since the time of Salvador Allende. And I don't mean when he was president, and I don't just mean when he was health minister, but when he published one of the most important books on health inequities in Latin America, which really looked x-rayed at their production, their structural, systematic production, rather than simply observing them. Now, I do teach medical anthropology here, and I have this major pet peeve, which is students doing their doctoral exams always come with their wonderful initial bibliography of work in medical anthropology. They often work with me because they might be working in Latin America or elsewhere, and I say, this is interesting now. You want to work in Mexico, Guatemala, Venezuela, wherever, and there's not one single source in here from any scholar who actually lives in that country or often even in Latin America, right? So as if somehow in Europe, the United States, we produce theory and somehow it's bodies and data in the rest of the world. That's imperialist ignorance, right? This is not a blissful ignorance, right? This is particularly not looking at the literature in Spanish and Portuguese, primarily on medicine and public health, that has offered since Allende's time rich theoretical frameworks for understanding these problems. Innovative methodological works that critique both notions of quantitative and qualitative and how they get mixed, healthcare and medical practices and forms of intervention, and provide powerful alternative models of solidarity. Howard Waitskin, who recently retired from the University of New Mexico, and I have spent a lot of time kind of moving back and forth between spaces in Latin America where we've been learning about these things and trying to bring some of this knowledge to the to audiences in the North and in Europe. And it's wonderful to be able to have joined forces with Seth Holmes and really made this part of the fundamental program of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine, which is precisely anti-imperialistic and anti-colonial in its theoretical orientation as well as the range of actors who are seen as being in dialogue and who gets to speak. Now, there are a number of giants in this field, which generally goes under the name of collective health, salud colectiva, social medicine, critical epidemiology, but the name Jaime Breilh Pasimiño seems to echo across the spaces where people dare to dream about medicine and public health as spaces for imagination and emancipation, not just for justifying injustices of race, class, gender, sexuality, and species. Dr. Breilh is the rector, that means like the president, chancellor, that kind of thing, of the Andean University Simón Bolívar. This is a remarkable place. It is a university for Latin America, not simply for Ecuador. It is also primarily a graduate-oriented university that tries to be able to carve out an independent space of learning and critique for this entire region and has defended that space most recently under a tremendous wave of repression that has attempted to be able to impose forms of governance on the university and to shape its basic operating principles. And I say that as somebody who's teaching here at this wonderful University of California, in terms of thinking about that as a model of saying what is the importance of having a truly critical and independent university. And then again, he's also the dean or director of the health area of that university. He's the founder of a program in collective health, environment, and society, a PhD program in which I've been privileged to teach since its founding now over a decade ago. He also did something, was the founder of the Andean Commission on the Social Determinants of Health, and was the founder and executive director of an amazing little research unit that did the most critical work on health and environment in Ecuador and far beyond, translated as the Health Research and Advisory Center of Quito. Recent president of the Ecuadorian Academy of Medicine, and he has taught throughout the world, including Michigan, UCSD, Harvard in Spain, in Portugal, in Mexico, and Canada. Trained at the Central University of Ecuador in medicine, received an MA at UAM Xochimilco, the Autonomous University of Mexico, in social medicine, a PhD in epidemiology from the University of Bahia, and a study also at the London Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene. Author of, I don't know what he does in his spare time, 21 books in Spanish, English, and Portuguese, co-author of 63 books, author of more than 100 articles in multiple languages. For English speakers, here's your little guide to reading Jaime Breilh, all right? If you read English and that's all, go for his article on Latin American critical epidemiology, New Settings for an Old Dream in the International Journal of Epidemiology in 2008. But really, you ought to read the Spanish, folks, for his critical epidemiology, emancipatory science, and interculturality of 2003. Truly a must-read. So, also a founder and ex-coordinator of the Latin American Social Medicine Association. So a couple of major points, in case you don't know this work. First of all, he's emphasized social and especially ideological and political economic dimensions of the constitution of scientific knowledge about health and disease. So he argues that the epistemological and theoretical analysis, critique and transformation of the very fundamental notions of health and disease and healthcare is crucial to challenge the way that hegemonic medicine and public health, including epidemiology, have defined saberes científicos, scientific forms of knowledge that get labeled as scientific, and the technical rationalities associated with them. He's emphasized the triple effects of the determination of health inequities, including social class, gender, and also inequities of race and ethnicity, and helping to pioneer a critical and multicultural formulation that challenges culturalist and liberal notions of multiculturalism. He also tries to move us from just looking at health disparities to try to understand really what are the forces that shape those, from what health professionals can directly see to contemporary and long-term historical effects, starting really with conquest in the Americas on the broader forces, including relations of domination that shape health. He similarly urges us to focus on health inequities as opposed to health disparities. He has long argued that conceptual epistemological critiques need to be linked to methodological critiques and innovations. And one of the major export industries of Ecuador, which you may have unwittingly observed during Valentine's Day, is cut flowers, particularly roses. The vast greenhouses place thousands of workers in Ecuador in high-stress conditions requiring continuous rapid movement and often in constant exposure to toxic chemicals. And he actually is the co-creator of the Pentox system for participatory research on neurotoxic and psychotoxic disturbances produced by exposure to pesticides and other toxics, and created basically a system that, of course, no one in the United States would be interested in, of putting a green dot on a bouquet of flowers to indicate that somebody has been looking with the workers at the health of the workers in those sites of production. Right? Wouldn't that be nice if we thought about something like that in the United States as they do in Europe? And finally, has studied processes of global acceleration and dispossession in terms of their impact on health in Ecuador and beyond, with attention to the possibilities of a profound democratization of public health research through incorporation of the Quechua indigenous concept of sumak kasai, a principle of balanced and integrated good living, hard to translate into, let alone Spanish, but more into English, from Andean indigenous cosmology. He uses it as a means of demedicalizing conceptions of health and environment and broadening the production of knowledge and action in order to challenge profound inequities. We are very, very happy that he was able to make the very long trip from Ecuador, take a little time away from what must be amazing duties as the rector or president of the university, so we're pleased to have him. At the same time, we're just as happy to have two of our colleagues from here at Berkeley who will serve as his respondents, because our idea is to foster dialogue And we all want to be able to keep that dialogue moving in multiple sorts of ways. So Professor Amani Nuru-Jeter is an associate professor of epidemiology in the Community Health Sciences Department and the King Sweezy and Robert Womack Chair in Medical Research and Public Health in our own School of Public Health. She received her BA at the University of Maryland College Park, her MPH from George Washington, and her PhD from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Her broad research interest is to integrate social, demographic, and epidemiological methods to examine racial inequities in health as they exist across populations, places, and life courses. She considers herself to be more exposure than outcomes focused, which is consistent with her interest in examining social factors like race, social class, as exposures that serve as the foundation for the creation and the preservation of health inequities across a number of outcomes. She is interested in how these social exposures determine life experiences and opportunities differently for different social groups, and how those differences become embodied, and impact mental and physical health and well-being. She's a Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar and has won, for good reason, numerous teaching and mentorship awards right here at Berkeley. And I'm not even going to begin to talk about the amazing range of journals in which she has published her work. Nancy Peluso is the Henry Vaux Distinguished Professor of Forest Policy in ESPM, Environmental Science and Policy Management. I thought I had that right. She received her BA in Anthropology at the Friends World College, her MS in the Sociology of Agricultural and Natural Resources, and her PhD in Sociology of Agricultural and Natural Resources at Cornell. She studies the social processes that affect the management of land-based resources using ethnographic mixed methods, ethnographic, historical, and other broadly sociological research methods. I mean, anthropologists claim ethnography a little bit too, but we'll let that one go by. Her work explores dimensions of resource access, use, and control, comparing and contrasting local, national, and international influences on management structures and processes. She grounds her analysis of contemporary resource management policy and practice in local and regional histories, and is particularly interested in how social difference, ethnic identity, class, gender, and other, affects resource access and control. She asks how governments and non-government institutions, actors define, make claims on, contest, and attempt to manage natural resources. And she's a great figure in the field of political ecology. She also ran this political ecology workshop. And frankly, Berkeley's really departmentalized and disciplined. So to have this seminar where people came from across the university for years to come in, and it was great because, someone would come and send their paper in advance, and the speaker, the great visitor, would have to shut up, until everyone sort of debated that paper which they had read until they got to respond. It was an amazing contribution to the community, but it suggests also the range of her vision within political ecology. Her work forms part of a collective called Land Lab, and which I suggest you might look at their website. Her work encompasses a broad range of topics in land and forest management, agrarian politics, and socio-environmental change, and she has conducted research on the history of political forests in Southeast Asia, linking global geopolitics, professional forestry institutions, and national natural resource law to the production of state territories and the shifting experience of forest dwellers. I ain't even going to begin to get into the publications for the two respondents, or else they'd never have a chance to respond, nor would Dr. Breilh have a chance to give his paper, so I'm going to, at this point, hand the floor to him, and thanks to all three of you for coming today.
Well, a very good afternoon to all of you. I want to first state many thanks to the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine, the California Nurses Association, the National Nurses United, and especially to Charles Briggs for the opportunity and privilege of participating in this North-South colloquium with my distinguished colleagues, Dr. Nuru-Jeter and Peluso. I'm very honored to be here with you it's for me a privilege to be here with both you, having the privilege of hearing and learning from your comments. I'm going to do something that I did yesterday in my brief participation in a panel, which is letting this important audience know about something that is happening in my small, beautiful, and peaceful country, Ecuador, where in this 21st century, 3 neoliberal governments were overturned without violence, where our social and academic movements were victorious in the struggle for a new constitution that consecrates the preeminence of human rights over big business, that honors an intercultural philosophy of equitable, good living, and the rights of nature, which now has been subject in recent weeks to the attack and blackmail by a criminal band formed by a dissident fraction of the Colombian FARC, equipped with modern arms and military resources. They are trying to penetrate in Ecuador and open a new traffic territory, protecting it as a Praetorian guard of transnational drug cartel operations, and so have kidnapped and murdered 3 Ecuadorian journalists who were investigating their previous terrorist attacks to our military precincts, where 4 of our soldiers were also killed. The world and you must know about this, and for this reason I take the opportunity of this presentation to dedicate my participation in this colloquium to the memory of my fallen countrymen. One more sign of the profound global crisis of the greedy capitalist societies that this well-informed, human rights conscious audience needs to know in this magnificent university known for its history, spirit, and dignity. I also want to dedicate these reflections, and I dearly do so, to nurses and other health professionals that work as researchers, activists, and healthcare operators in this great country, who struggle to reveal the pathogenic and harmful structure of market, patriarchal, and racist societies, and struggle for the protection and promotion of human health and wellness. I also want to dedicate this. This colloquium places health justice at the heart of our reasoning. One key argument of my talk is our need to understand that critical thinking and methodology make part of the struggle for health justice. And this is clearly stated by Virchow, this with his radical, groundbreaking health science statement when he says, preserving health and preventing disease requires full and unlimited democracy and radical measures rather than mere palliatives. I will try to explain in my reasoning that certain paradigms, certain models of understanding epidemiology and public health are those constructions of mere palliatives. So radical, say critical measures require radical thinking and methodology. So the basic aim of this presentation is not a statement of empirical data about inequality and a specific factor-based agency. It is intended as a contribution to conceptual debate and interchange about real, comprehensive, transformative health science of critical structures process. I will be using some categories and reasoning that pertain to the Latin American science tradition. They may not sound familiar to you, but in this short time I will try to explain them and why they feed transformative lever knowledge. My reflections are based on our experience built on critical research, graduate teaching, worker and community-based incidence programs for the defense and the advancement of worker, community, and nature's rights. I'm working with some general underlying questions. What original contributions of critical Latin American collective health inform the global intercultural debate on health research? From that perspective, what is the essence of our struggle in front of the present multiple global health crisis? So the contents of my talk are first understanding or profiling the global crisis, and as a means to understand why the urge for transformative research in the 21st century. Conceptual premises on critical science, and some milestones on the construction of Latin American meta-critical epidemiology. So global crisis. Everybody speaks of global crisis. Everybody speaks of climate change, of the enormous expansion, the massive expansion of certain destructive processes all around the globe. So why the urge for transformative research in the 21st century? What is the essence of the crisis of life and health in the 21st century? If the concentrating and excluding capital market economy was always inequitable and destructive to life, what is the uniqueness of today's dominant society? And here I would state first that capital accumulation in the corporate healthcare industry and access to care inequality is fundamental. They are fundamental, of course they are. This can be summed up in a book that, thanks to Charles Briggs, I just learned about, which is my dear friend Howard Waskind's book, where he says, contradictory political medical landscape gives cause for anguish and hope. People in nations around the world continue to rely on inequitable and inadequate health systems. An increasingly transnational corporate healthcare industry, meanwhile, aggressively aims to exploit the gaps left open by underfunded or non-existent public provision, furthering commodification and fragmentation. That's the absurd, that's the perversity of this, which is brilliantly summarized in this statement by Howard. I understand the importance and the centrality of this issue and the struggle that is made for that. But I will go a little beyond that. I will not deal tonight with that healthcare system, part of our struggle. I will not refer today to that part of the problem, but to some broader global challenges of collective health. When I say collective health, I mean that in Latin America since the 80s, we have been working not with the concept which is more restrictive of public health, which means the institutionally based activities or programs that are developed, but collective health, which is much broader than public health. Wellness and optimal life, if you would seek for the principles of integral life, wellness of a healthy society, they presuppose, in my opinion, what I call the 4 S's of life, which are structurally denied today. First, a sustainable economy for the reproduction of living beings, not for the business of corporations. A sovereign libertarian identity and culture, not the subordination of nations, peoples, communities, and everything toward the interests of big capital expansion. Solidary politics and agency for equitable relations, not the greedy destruction of a minority that goes above and over and demolishes the rights and the conditions of living of the majority, and integral human and natural biosecurity for a healthy society, nature, metabolism, healthy social spaces, and modes of living and access to care. I have operationalized these categories in my research to unfold each of one of those 4 S's in the different elements that make up the conditions, or these conditions, the scope of conditions for life. But under capital accumulation, as a form of social reproduction, those 4 S's are systematically destroyed and submitted to dominant relations intertwined to private wealth concentration. And in the heart of that expansion of this destructive mode of social reproduction, we find 3 processes or 3 mechanisms that are accelerating that economic accumulation. First, capital convergence for productivist greedy uses of technologies. The problem is not transgenics or genetically modification. The problem is the greedy logic that incorporates that in a manner and in a form that implies destructive elements for life. This possession, which implies the appropriation and concentration of life goods, land, water, genome, and generally the biota. And shock. Even shock is a mechanism of fast-track capital accumulation. Katrina, the experience of Katrina, that Naomi Klein brilliantly explains in his book about the shock capital, accumulation of capital, is the opportunistic exploitation of disasters, pandemics, and fear. So these 3 mechanisms are triggering the monstrous, perverse processes of destruction of each one of those 4 S's. Sustainability, sovereignty, solidarity, and integral security or biosecurity. And one of the elements, the key elements of that process, can be summarized in extractivism. The extreme appropriation, concentration of life goods, land, water, genome, and in general biotope and biocenosis, is clearly a health hazard, a destructive process, not a risk. We are going to contradict the logic of risk factors, which not only is a methodological fragmentation, but it also divides the process so you don't understand it. You just see it bits and pieces, and you work with the bits and pieces, but you don't understand the logic of the whole. And this logic is not merely or primarily due to ethical or cultural deviations. It is mainly a result of objective, material, structural, and systemic conditions. In Latin America, in the last decade, some governments that define it themselves as progressive installed a very pretentious model of being, some even say, revolutionary. The discourse of a good extractivism that pays for the social expenditures, which was the excuse for extractivism, appears as a common characteristic of auto-proclaimed progressive Latin American governments, among which were the past Ecuadorian government. During the past 2 decades, some of the political leaders of these regimes even exacerbated their image of progressiveness, defining their administrations as revolutionary, in contrast with what was repeatedly demonized as the dark era of neoliberalism. But let's look at some facts. I don't want to fill you with facts which contradict that. But in the case of Ecuador, look at what happened with the basic living standards. The discourse, the political discourse, we were rising to sky-high levels of progress. But look at the income Gini index. It isn't significantly modified. look at the poverty per percentage of population. Okay, it's a small reduction, which we can prove that is basically produced by statistical artifacts. And land concentration Gini index, which not only is stagnated, but it grows to a 0.8 level of concentration of land. And when the discourse says, well, we're investing a lot in social elements like education and health, okay, yes, those investments were done, building hospitals, which is of course a good thing, building, giving equipment to those hospitals, contracting more personnel, but each one of those processes was filled with corruption, and was financed through processes of hidden corruption by overpayment of the costs of those projects. And you see that when you see the trends for the previous quinquennial period and the 2006-2012, you see that the per capita health expenditure doesn't make really a big slope difference with the previous year. So it was growing anyway. It was growing under a logic of the pressure of our people for that. And doctors per 1,000 inhabitants also, you could see a slope difference, but it was done in a way that it has many peculiarities. Because, first of all, it's done in a way that is overexploiting the task force of the hospitals, that were tripling the number of patients without any compensation, without any sound measures of protective of labor conditions. And when you take a look at conventional socially sensitive indicators, epidemiologic indicators as infant mortality or maternal mortality, etc., they are descending in the normal, let's say, normal trend slope. You don't see a significant difference of what is going on, because the model that is applied is absolutely conventional, and it's controlled by the providers of equipment, of drugs, etc., which are making the more business than ever before. And I can go on, and I could say that, okay, a little bit of correction of certain changes in the children's population. For instance, anemia for scarcity of micronutrients is corrected with little provision of compensations, which are not dealing with the problem. Many of those anemic conditions of children are not due to nutritional reasons. They are due to toxicity, blood marrow toxicity for the exposure, because those are children in the rural areas that are exposed to chemicals systematically and all the time. But the weak or inconsistent variations in conventional social and health indicators is less worrisome. The real profound inconsistencies appear when we look at the accelerated expansion of unhealthy, class-segregated forms of production and modes of living. And I will illustrate this reasoning taking the example of agribusiness. It has become a critical process of structural unhealthiness and contributes to what I have described as a global toxic bonfire, determining extreme crisis of sustainability, the first S, a crisis of sustainability of life, because the logic of big business, of big-scale agriculture, of corporate agriculture, for that kind of logic, biodiversity is bad business. Biodiverse scenarios are not good business for capitalism. Works well with specialized and continuous processes where monotony is basic for potentiating rentability. Dispossession, land, water, plus capital convergence for productivist and healthy uses of technologies. That's the logic. That's what's happening. So the reproduction and acceleration of capital accumulation conditions to install highly specialized and continuous processes, monotonous, non-diverse spaces on a large scale, accelerating processes by the three mechanisms I mentioned, reducing costs and increasing differential income by subjecting the small familiar producers to very unfair conditions and to a comparison which is perverse of rentabilities and of capacity for reduction of prices. So destroying ancestral cultural patterns of agroecological communities is basic for the development and expansion of agribusiness. So here you have a sowing toxic climate and a social warming. There cannot be climate warming without social warming, quote unquote. What I mean is that global scale acceleration of capital accumulation triggers or needs or needs to be reproduced a certain civilization and a unicultural hegemony in the conception of nature, of work, of agriculture, of everything, a destructive metabolism between society and nature, and this social warming is the oxidizer, is the blower, whereas you have the biotope warming is the fuel, and the biocenosis degradation with its toxic modifications. So here you have a global scale, cumulative, unhealthy processes that kill human and natural processes. Let me give you a brief example of Brazil as an emblematic example. I was shocked. A little parenthesis. I was reading The Guardian last night, and I was reading that now we have a copy of the President Trump's style in Brazil. The new candidate is a little Trump, but much more aggressive in Brazil. Well, that's a parenthesis. Let's close the parenthesis. Let's go back to epidemiology. Brazil, emblematic example, the big brother of harmful agriculture in Latin America. Just look at a research that was published as a dossier that is published both in Portuguese and Spanish that was presented to the Senate of, it was made by 30 universities of Brazil, top-notch universities of Brazil, researchers of 30 universities in Brazil, and I was privileged to be one of the Council of Scientific advice for that work. But look at the examples of different products, pineapple, you have all the fruits and all the groceries that are sold widely in a national sample of Brazil. They are all contaminated. They are brand nicely packed in the supermarket, but they're all filled with toxic or multiple contaminants. Toxic components, hormones, antibiotics, etc. Agrochemical contamination of all the water network of Brazil. It's all contaminated now. Superficial and groundwater. And just to give you an example, chemical contamination of breast milk. Up to 6 pesticides in samples of breast milk were found. So we're talking about an enormously expanded process that someday ends up in the hospital. But that's afterwards. That's after all this perversity is going on. In that context, another invariable victim is the secondness, sovereignty. Not only the broad laws of sovereignty that big companies impose in aspects like the autonomous political ruling of our countries, parentheses, constitutional coup d'etat, or the control of land, water, and seeds of our farmers and peoples all over the world, that we know, land grabbing, water grabbing. Coca-Cola owns 70% of the private water of the world, of the consumable potable water of the world. I was in India teaching a seminar about a couple months ago, and I learned about this, that what Coca-Cola has done with water in India is something. It's amazing. I mean, I'm sure you know about that story, but it's really tremendous. But also the forced disappearance of health autonomic governance. The destruction of sovereignty penetrates the international health cooperation field. Governments used to conduct sovereign WHO's negotiation. WHO is supposedly an assembly of governments. Under neoliberal global rule, corporations penetrated international governing bodies and took over the international organization and government of WHO. The financial control of WHO is evident. And this was clearly visualized in the AH1N1 pandemic, which was a construct. It was an interested construct for business. According to WHO reports, its budget for years 2012-13 amounted to $3,959 million US dollars. According to its general counsel, 18% of its financing came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. 700. So I think they have some saying in the board. Okay, but if we add that the fact that according to the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation annual budget report, its budget for those same years amounted to $3,635 million US dollars. So who rules the logic of international cooperation in the world? It's not any more governments. It's big business with the logic that it has and the logic to direct. And then that becomes policies and technical application and nice fancy books about methodology and protocols in all the ministries of health of the world. No? So if we go on and we take a look at the Briggs, the countries, the emerging economies, countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but not only those, well, in spite of their evident historical and cultural differences, they share important characteristics which potentiate capital accumulation, acceleration, and destructive modes of living of the capitalist civilization. Extended territories, immense national markets, powerful ruling groups eager to expand growth under inequitable social relations monopolizing vital resources, fast expansion of unhealthy consumption patterns for the poor, all of which enhance favorable scenarios for unhealthy living modes. It's not risk factors. It's living modes. It's the structural living modes that you cannot change by controlling parts and risks independently. They constitute a gigantic socioeconomic machinery for forest deterioration, multiplication of social inequity, and unhealthy contrasts of living conditions. And here we have the results of that. What Otero and colleagues have called the neoliberal diet. The neoliberal diet, while upper income groups have had increasing access to higher quality foods, lower to middle income class diets are heavily focused on energy dense fares. This neoliberal diet is clearly associated with a proliferation of obesity that disproportionately affects the poor. We provide a critical review of the debate about obesity from within the critical camp in food studies between individual focused and structural perspectives. Individual focalized on nutrition, and they train our trainees are learning only to deal with individual process or dimensions of malnutrition, but not with the collective logic, with the processes in the whole. So we want to change the whole through acting with a part, and that has shown for all these decades as a big lie. So the neoliberal diet corresponds to a neoliberal mode of living, and this is integral. I'm talking about the diet, but the mode of living incorporates modes of working, modes of consuming, modes of spiritual, cultural activities, neoliberal forms of association, of relationship. And now that we have the new dimension of social space, which is cyberspace, we have a subsumption of our population very profoundly in that. So agriculture has become a critical process of structural unhealthiness and contributes to this toxic bonfire. And we can clearly contrast agriculture of death and agriculture of life. Agriculture destructive of the four S's, global scale, with a fracture of the urban-rural fracture, waste, enormous waste, monopolic logic, land seeds and water resources are monopolized, subordinate to corporations, not sovereign, not solidary and inclusive, but exclusive. It destroys our culture, no bioinsurance, etc., etc., etc. And we have the agriculture for life, for the four S's, which is the local scale agriculture, etc., alliance, urban-rural alliance, rationalization savings, sustainable diversity. So if you ask me, what is a public health agency agenda? It's not working with with communities and people and children, even though you can take nice pictures and you can sound very humane, but you have to change all that. If we don't switch to that, in the whole world, we won't have a planet pretty soon. So we need to face that with a new conceptual framework, with some, which implies that we understand some premises for transformative science. So we'll live in a world of concentrated opulence and technology in some regions, owned, controlled by powerful minorities, and at the same time of ever worsening poverty, unattended needs, and unhealthiness for the vast majorities. Our specific epidemiologic statement would be the need for transformative research on the social determination of health. I will try to explain the difference between social determinants and social determination, which is very important, of health, class, gender, and ethnic relations. Critical thinking methodology make part of the struggle for social justice. So this means that we have to deal with understanding and work in operating over the objective part of health, the ontological conception, which is unhealthy existing conditions. We have to deal with health-related ideas which reproduce dominance and reproduce these unhealthy trends. And we have to deal with collective practices that have to change in order to operate real changes in the field of collective health. So a comprehensive view of critical thinking would be a philosophy that questions the material, objective, as well as the cultural, subjective fundaments of society, not only the risk factors. I'm insisting with this jump of logic. Therefore, it questions the mode of dominant social reproduction and its civilization. It implies a broad intercultural meta-critique. Concomitantly, it questions the dominant practices and ethos. Foucault, in his art of critique, said that if we're going to operate with critical knowledge, we know that means reinventing epistemological certainties, discerning and unveiling mechanisms of coercion, and thinking in subjugating ideas that are holding us in these regressive trends, interrogate the politics of truth, the right to question truth, transgressing one's limits to our desubjugation, and deconstruct limits to our subjecthood. When we find a powerful union like the nurses operating in the whole world and giving the good faith of the health professionals, what they're doing is they are not accepting to be subordinated. They understand the perversity of the system, of the health system, and they operate in a trend that is desubjugating. So we have to apprehend an emancipatory epidemiological critique, not only criticizing empirical evidences. Oh my goodness, we have to diminish 10% of the infant mortality. We have to diminish 20% of the maternal mortality, blah, 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 blah. All those empirical, fragmented risk factor logic, which is based only on the visibility of the peak of the iceberg indicators. Not only criticize the epistemic or cultural conditions that reproduce inequity. To avoid an incomplete and uprooted process, emancipatory epidemiological criticism implies questioning the material basis and the epistemological cultural basis, which means capitalism as a mode of production and capitalism as a civilization. When they ask me, is critical epidemiology implying a change of the society? My goodness, yes. So it's revolutionary. The formulation of metacritique, the ecology of knowledges, according to the words of my dear friend Boaventura Santos. I prefer metacritique because ecology of knowledges doesn't sound like a good import from ecology. It doesn't work in the epistemic field, but that doesn't matter. We mean the same thing. Critical perspectives for a metacritique are not the atomization of different struggles, which work in not looking at each other, not complementing each other, but separately, like the political organizations of the left, like the feminist organizations, like ethnic organizations, ecological activists, health activists, academic subjects, etc. we have to deal with a metacritique that is armed with all the powerful tools that each one of those struggles provides humanity for its protection and for its emancipation. And this implies something that I find very clearly explained in the last handbook of interdisciplinarity produced by the Oxford University Press, which is differentiating between juxtaposing knowledges versus transdisciplinarity, which means transcending, transgressing, transforming. It's not only juxtaposing, sequencing, coordinating knowledges, it implies transcending, transgressing, and transforming. So when we work in a transdisciplinary emancipatory logic, we have to give the jump to that side, which means a more profound complementation, integration, and collaboration. And to do that, to keep the ball rolling, we need to work with a clearly strategical, critical intercultural science program, which has to deal with providing all the critical science and instrumental resources that the struggle needs. That is, with a combination of knowledges, not only academic knowledges, but also the knowledges of the people that are very powerful. And the block of affected worker communities, which is the subject of the movement. So these are the tools. This is the subject, and this is the agenda. But if we don't have a clear agenda for transformation, integral agenda, and we are only dealing with a list of risk factors that we have to deal with, then we don't have a process of transformative science. We only have functional science that is very comfortably absorbed by the powerful. So the construction of Latin American critical metacritical science on health is a long run since the 70s, and many publications have been going around Latin America for many years, for decades, since the 70s. And in those publications, as early as the second half of the 70s, we're talking about social determination of health. In 2005, Europe talks about social determinants of health. Many decades later, not one of these words was mentioned. It was a Eurocentric construction, opportunistic construction, that took ideas of the South without mentioning them, but inscribing them in the logic of positivistic, linear, reductionist thinking. And that's why the determinación social de la salud was transformed to determinantes sociales, which is a new form, a new way of causality, of linear reductionist thinking. So there has been a struggle. There's been a paradigm clash, because science doesn't grow, doesn't progress in a smooth upward trend. It is dialectic. It's a clash of views. It's a clash of paradigms, and you have in each century the main clashes of paradigms that have been there to define the logic and the essence of epidemiology. In the 18th century, in the first half of the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, and now social determinants versus social determination. This is a new form of functional science. And if you want, we can deal with that I don't have time right now, but I would like to stress the fact, using the example of my country, that the advancement of progressive paradigms occurs when there are historical moments of revolution. You see 3 periods of revolution. Those were the jumps. Those were the of immense social commotion, were the scenario for the jumps in the scientific development. Critical epidemiology beyond social epidemiology, because social epidemiology, in my understanding, well, I understand that the way it is used can be critical and can be very profoundly analytical. It's okay, but it's wrong in the sense that we don't say social sociology, because that's a tautology. It's no sense to speak about social sociology. It's no sense to speak about social epidemiology, because epidemiology is social. So what it has to be is critical. That's why we struggle for the last name critical and not social in Spanish. Okay, so it has to be critical, and we have this contemporary dilemma. There are 3 books that have been written in Latin America, whole big important books about the difference between social determinants of health and social determination of health. I won't stop in that. I don't have time. I don't want to take too long time. But we have to go beyond causal epidemiology. That's an important thing. And I would like to stress this idea that you find here on this side. This is a matrix that I use in one of my last books about explaining the paradigms of epidemiology. These are the paradigms that I have studied as critical epidemiologies. You have the social medicine, founding movement of social medicine. You have the critical ethno-social epidemiology. You have eco-social epidemiology with Nancy Krieger. You have the worse in work epidemiology of Christina Lauder, and you have the social determination epidemiology, where we have met with a very important Brazilian researcher. And critical epidemiology implies these theoretical methodological ruptures. These ruptures not only about the difference between determinants and determination. You can go over the slide a little later to see what are the different ways of understanding the object of health, the subject of health, and the practical or praxical elements. I won't stay in that. I ask you to please study that, because now the new dominant trend is social determinants of health, and that makes us lose all the power, the emancipatory logic of critical epidemiology. Main ruptures, of course, is the knowledge illusion of linear reductionist thinking, the Cartesian conception of relations between different variables that link in explaining another outcome variable, and that can be linked to others, and then you have like McMahon's structure of a network of causality. Or you can have complex processes of principal factors or surrounding variables that can have. But the problem is that when you break the world in this way, when you understand, you see the world in factors, then you act over factors. You don't act over processes in a structural process. You work over factors. And all your resources, all your logic is going to factors. And you have packages of factors, and you have program A with that, program B with that. You might produce some certain changes in the isolated elements, but you don't change society as a whole and its unhealthiness as a whole. And the risk factor logic in diabetes, the problem is that when you operate the factor logic, then you're working with the peak of the iceberg, and you're working with isolated empirical evidences, disconnected or externally connected, and you're not understanding the social determination. The only way to link the processes of the empirical evidences is understanding how they are generated by critical processes that have a thrust in changing things in a way that appear finally as those variables or those evidences. So we not a Cartesian part-to-whole determinism, but dialectic processes that you can understand. So the difference is not working with factors causes, xy, x1, x2, x3, x4, x2000 with an outcome, or many outcomes, or multivariate structures or whatever, but we need to understand the processes of determination, and in that movement find the way that the empirical world moves, and then we can have a different implication for the variables. So positivist linear reductionist thinking as matrix of dominant scientific illiteracy, repeated empirical scientific truth about risk factors displaces complex processes understanding. Because we're full of very sophisticated mathematical models of this reductionist logic. But the problem is, if you present a work which has the other logic, it will not be approved. It will get, because the journals are all property of corporations. All are property of corporations. Alternatively, let's look at dengue. Let's look at the dengue example, which is probably the 5 minutes. The dengue example. You can either look at dengue like this, as a model like this, infective sources, individual exposure, individual vulnerability, individual coping resources, etc., and you have a frequency and probability of cases, or you can look at the context where dengue is generated. Like in this case, you have a region in Ecuador. The red part is the city of Machada, where the dengue scenario is. As you know, dengue is an urban, very in the housing areas. And you have this, which is the shrimp pools, and you have this ocean of banana. This is the capital of production of banana of the world. And this is the result that you see. That ocean is the result of a process, historical process of land concentration. As I said, monopoly is the way to really be competitive in the world of capital competition. And you have all those little properties are now for big enterprises. In those areas, you use all this model of structural massive contamination, degraded soils, etc. It's all a destructive ecosystem, human, cultural, everything destruction. Without doing what used to be done to produce banana, which is a perfectly viable and clearly more productive than the other. Because we have a research project that we're doing the econometric calculations to show that this is more productive. And then you need another model, which is to understand that dengue transmission is a complex socially determined process, that the construction of infective sources is socially determined, the exposure, vulnerability, and distribution patterns, the public policies and agency, the construction of coping systems, the social, natural, metabolism, and ecosystemic, they are all elements that can only be understood in the big scenario. So this is, tell me with this I finish. We are researching this area. We are proving that with high precision agricultural analysis, we are proving that when the agricultural areas are cold, they don't contribute to climate warming. And the conventional production of banana are warm and have high the grids are clearly mathematically, you can prove that exactly. And we are working with operationalization of the 4S's to show how superior the forms of agricultural production are, which are not destructive and they protect the 4S's. Okay, well, I'll finish that. This is all a participative process. It implies changing the logic of conjunction, etc. I won't go into that. You can, but I will finish with this, with two more slides. Be patient with me. Here, this is more or less a synthesis of our general model. We have the broader green, which is nature. A part of nature is this society. There is a metabolism between nature and society. And society, of course, is multidimensional. It has a general logic of capital production in each region. It has groups that operate with their own specific modes of living, of social class, gender, and ethnic relations. And inside those groups, we have individuals. So here, in these individuals, the results, many of the effects of this whole movement end up here. But if we only do a survey and find out individual data, we are only finding a small part of the picture. You have to, even to understand that small part, you need to understand this whole movement. And then the health field is action, again, towards the whole, not to isolated bits and pieces, but it's a move to transform the whole. That means that you need transdisciplinarity, because you need to understand clearly those processes that are interconnected. You need critical theory of space and political economy for the broader. You need critical sociology and anthropology, and which is also and critical biology in clinics, and critical epidemiology deals with the whole, and then you have the critical ecology and political ecology to understand that. So transdisciplinarity is not an invention. An agriculture for life is possible, because you can find that in Brazil there are many, as I showed you, that there are many places that are being destroyed. There are many places that are doing the opposite also. There's a struggle of models of life versus death. And in Ecuador, we can show you that in 5 years you can do production of cut flowers for export, that in 5 years you can reduce 71% the consumption of water, with the absurd consumption, over-consumption of water that is produced because you have to mix water with pesticides. If you don't use pesticides, you don't need that much water. And you have beautiful roses without wasting that. And you can reduce, look, in 5 years you can reduce the chemicals, and you can use alternative biological containment of pesticides, and you can do with fertilizers the same thing. In 5 years, you can change your farm. We're doing that as part of the Andina Ecosaludable program of research to develop a package where you can clearly demonstrate, even to producers, that you can work in a better way. Our university is working in this project. We have a whole structure that you can think of this university reform project that we're working with the productores campesinos, agroecológicos in the zones of the city. It's a research agency, postgrad community training and communication project, and it operates in a section of city that we want to declare in 5 years zona de comer limpio, de comer sano, seguro en Quito. This is more or less what we've been doing. For this, we need a critical knowledge, a critical social determination perspective, and we need to rescue that powerful indigenous philosophy and knowledge about Mother Nature is powerful. So this alliance between academia and the people's knowledges is profound. This we do in every one of our processes. Their thinking is powerful, our thinking also. We can link both schemes for rebuilding the whole logic of knowledge, and we can have this relationship between the indigenous knowledge of summa causae with the academic knowledge of vivir saludable that we work from epidemiology. So it's a perfectly compatible and it's a transgressing interculturality that we need. So we need to hear all voices and learn from all cultures, but you need to integrate them. The construction of a unifying narrative, meta-narrative, or discourse, it should be unifying without being dominant. It has to integrate all emancipating, complementary, progressive discourses. It convenes all critical perspectives about the object of social and spiritual transformation. Not only our grandfathers or grandmothers work with this vision of knowing that knowledge is not only logos, but it's not only logic, but it's also heart. And I think the same thing Einstein said, that knowledge is compassion. And this means that we humanize science and not this cold, peer-reviewed nonsense. Okay? Thank you. Sorry. Oh, okay.
So Dr. Amani Nuru-Jeter. Next.
Thank you so much. Well, hello, everyone. Give me 1 second. I want to make sure this shows. Just take a breather for like 5 minutes. I'm going to put it right here. Oh, okay. Thank you. So, even more so than when I read initially read your slides. Right now, what I really want to say is just how full I am. I'm very full right now, and so I thank you for an amazing presentation. I heard, and actually Nancy and I were joking earlier, and again I feel it even more so now, that really what I want to just stand here and say is what he said. and just go sit down, because I really don't think I can say it any better. But for the sake of kind of discourse, this north-south discourse, I really don't think it's a divide. There are lots of things that I heard that, engender a lot of similarities in the way that we think in the North and the South, whether we call it critical epidemiology or social epidemiology. There are lots of social epi students in the audience today, so I heard risk factorology, right? I heard eco-social perspective. I heard fundamental causes. I heard intersectionality. I heard the importance of historical context. I heard the political economy of health. I heard arguments about the epistemological critique of whose and what knowledge is valued and considered actual and real knowledge. I think that, in terms of social epidemiology and using that term social epidemiology, the one argument that I would make is in the United States, it is necessary, or at least at a time it was necessary. We might actually have a debate about whether we've moved beyond that and can switch to a term of critical epidemiology, or what one of my former students, Ryan Pettaway, calls a people's social epidemiology. But in the US, it has been necessary to use that terminology, social epidemiology. We could all argue and say that all epidemiology is social epidemiology. However, the contemporary, I would argue the historical and still unfortunately the contemporary practice of epidemiology in the United States is largely not social. And it has been primarily adding an additional group of variables that people primarily control for when they're really interested in the association between some other X and Y. Right, so artificially creating equality where equality doesn't exist, and really explaining away any contribution of these factors to really understanding population patterns of health. So I would argue that in the US, it has been necessary for us to really talk about social epidemiology, to distinguish that work as a more critical way of examining the social determinants of health, and not just using them as nuisance variables in our research, but really treating them as real exposures themselves. And then, when I look at the matrix you put up about critical epidemiology over to the side, I thought that's what we do in North America. We talk about social medicine. We talk about Vircho's work and Vierme's work and Susser's work and, all of the things that I think are somewhat consistent. I do really like that terminology of social determination, however. So we're going to have to co-author a piece so that I can use that term.
We need it in English.
We do need it in English, yes, we do. So lots of synergies there. So I saw this slide set originally about a week ago, and again, now just like then, I was really blown away. And I jotted down some reflections because we were asked, Nancy and I were asked to give about 5 minutes of just reflections to kind of start and motivate a Q&A on this. And then I woke up this morning thinking about this event and had completely new ideas, and so I trashed my comments. And then in between all of my meetings today, wrote down some new reflections. And so if you'll indulge me, I'd like to share some of those new reflections with you. So in a recent talk that I gave, I started my presentation with this slide, which shows the cover photo from a California newsreel documentary titled Race, the Power of an Illusion. And in this documentary, just like in Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent book, Between the World and Me, and previously in James Baldwin's book on being white and other lies, they talk about people who think they're white. And by that, they're referring to the social construction of race, something that really is about imagination, an illusory, right? A tool that really has been used to subjugate different groups into different statuses, dominant statuses, and subjugated statuses. The film documents through historical analysis the role of race, this thing that we call race, and the role that is played in creating and maintaining various forms of power differentials that have systematically excluded certain groups in the U.S., namely African and Native Americans, from full participation in the citizenry of the United States, setting the stage for social stratification for years to come. The film shows the impact of various legal practices and norms that systematically excluded these groups from participating in and reaping the rewards of an expanding economy, resulting in at least two different Americas. So this idea of race being an illusion really reflects the point Dr. Breilh made about how the ever-expanding concentration of wealth depends on the existence of poorness, just as white privilege depends on the existence of the disadvantaged status of black and brown bodies. Thus, the maintenance of power in certain groups is dependent upon the continued oppression of others. And importantly, that continued oppression does not require actual chains. Rather, the invisibility of those chains leads many to believe that intentional stratification is a thing of the past, and perhaps that social stratification is a necessary and inherent aspect of civil society. As Forbes and Wainwright posit, quote, "When habitus encounters a social world of which it is the product, it is like a fish in water. It does not feel the weight of the water, and it takes the world about itself for granted." Whereas some define race as a social construction, others define race as biological. Each view has its history, the former in relation to the process of colonization and slavery for economic gains during the western spread of the sugar industry and eventual expansion to the United States. This process of economic and racial subjugation laid the foundation for first de facto, then de jure racial classification in the United States, the remnants of which are present to this day, despite the cloak of colorblind racism, the myth of meritocracy, and post-racial politics. At issue is the process and experience of social stratification and the ways in which one's location in the social structure determines access to resources, physical, social, political, economic, many of the resources that Dr. Breilh commented on. As described, historical evidence indicates that the evolution of racial classification in the United States grew out of this systematic process of racial stratification and objectification that was motivated by economic interests and resulted in a race-based class structure with black and brown bodies as forced laborers and Europeans as owners. This race-based class structure endured post-emancipation, Reconstruction, and the backlash of Jim Crow. Despite the gains of the civil rights movement, this structure continues to this day as evidenced by racial differences in the distribution of socioeconomic position. Although not legally enforced, the enduring racially motivated class structure in the United States reified arguments about the inferiority of some groups relative to others and continues to find a home in contemporary practices and norms such as labor and wage discrimination, workplace discrimination, including organizational behavior related to decision-making, and informal networks in relation to mentoring and advancement, which lead to what Pager and Shepard call homosocial reproduction. Housing and lending, education policy and practice, including admissions, inclusive versus exclusive classrooms, and teacher prejudice, and race-based consumer marketing. These norms and practices contribute to the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage, or what Oliver and Shapiro referred to as, quote, the sedimentation of racial inequality. It is this and other forms of social inequality that many North American social epi scholars argue are the fundamental causes of health, and that to focus on the mediators of this relation is to miss the point entirely. So all those factors, that risk factorology that Dr. Breilh talked about. Hence, addressing health inequities is about addressing social inequities. I agree with Dr. Breilh that science is a tool that can be used for many things, one of which is to highlight social injustices and its impact on health. Which brings me to the related issue of scientific control. Who determines what knowledge is valued and what science is considered rigorous? Dr. Breilh's concept of social determination, not viewing our work as simply an empirical exercise, but a way to organize information in ways that illuminate injustice, raises the issue of critical theory. It has been said, and I quote, that critical theory perspectives are concerned with empowering human beings to transcend the constraints placed on them by race, class, and gender. And that, quote, researchers need to acknowledge their own power, engage in dialogues, and use theory to interpret or illuminate social action. Central to this endeavor is the scientific study of social institutions and the historical problems of domination, alienation, and social struggles, and a critique of society and the envisioning of new possibilities, which is where I think that social determination comes in. Not only envisioning those new possibilities, but actively working towards creating those new possibilities. The mantra of epidemiology and of science, I would argue more generally, regarding the practice of research is quote unquote strong objectivity. We have somehow convinced ourselves that in doing science, we let go of our human faculties and engage in a practice that is devoid of philosophical and socio-political leanings, and are somehow able to achieve what is considered the pinnacle of positivist thinking, unbiased, objective science, a sentiment characteristic of traditional epidemiologic approaches in the United States. In conducting such science, we are then able to maintain distance from our subjects, even the use of that word is problematic, and avoid the undue influence of our beliefs, our values, and our morals. However, the underlying assumption that we can actually achieve that reality of unbiased, objective work is not only questionable, but almost certainly unlikely. So what am I saying? I'm saying that with a high degree of certainty, i.e. the 95% confidence interval does not include one, that outcome is unachievable. Instead, this raises the question about whether that should even be the aim of scientific endeavors. Certainly, there is some utility in the particular stances we bring to our work, hence the nature of the questions we ask. In the US, the field of epidemiology has had a somewhat polarizing public debate on the distinction between science and advocacy. And that was a large message that I think I took away from your talk in thinking about social determinants of health and social determination, because the word determination, just adding I-O-N at the end, requires action. So this kind of distinction between science and advocacy, I think, has really plagued public health discourse and debate, and particularly in the field of epidemiology, i.e. the extent to which engaging in any form of advocacy, defined as public support for or a recommendation for a particular policy, makes our work less scientific. Although scientists advocate in their work all the time, that criticism has been especially harsh in relation to social epidemiology. No question that has to do with the social nature of the questions and the propositions that are being made. So the definition, and I'll close with this, of epidemiology is twofold. And I think we often pay attention to the first part of the definition, and we choose to forget that the second part of the definition exists. So that first part of the definition, the study of the distribution and determinants of states of health. But the aspect of the definition that people forget is what comes after the semicolon, which is to use that knowledge generated for the purposes of health promotion and disease prevention. To that end, some degree of activism is woven into the very definition of our field. With that, I will close and turn the podium over to Nancy.
Professor Nancy Peluso.
Long day, okay. Between you and the question and answer period. Well, thank you. I'm actually so honored to be invited here to comment on this amazing presentation, and thank you to both Charles and to Seth for inviting me.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome. I'm not sure I'm really the most appropriate person to be commenting here, because Rachel Morello-Frosch is our kind of critical environmental health expert, until we have also added Seth Holmes to our faculty. But perhaps I can make some comments today about how the kinds of ideas and action that Rector Breilh has presented coalesce with the ideas, research practices, and scholar activism that characterize the field of political ecology that we teach in our Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management, and in the Department of Geography. I'm with Amina. When I started reading the slides of today's presentation, I was kind of floored, even beginning with terms that are commonly known perhaps to people in this room. The fields of collective health, critical epidemiology, the integrated notion of health and social justice, the idea of Latin American social medicine. All these things are probably not so uncommon to you all, but the terms in themselves to me were exciting and inspiring in their implications. In Dr. In Dr. Breilh's original first slide, he declared that he was dedicating the talk not to the very deserving journalists and others who have been killed in recent approaches to environmental control in his part of the world, but to the researchers, activists, and health professionals of the United States who are struggling to reveal the pathogenic and harmful structures of markets, patriarchal and racist societies, and struggle for the protection and promotion of human health and wellness. I'm afraid, unfortunately, that this is a very small minority of the researchers and health professionals in the U.S., and probably most of them are sitting in this room right now. But I'm sure that I appreciate definitely the nod to that minority's engaged struggles. Unfortunately, unlike in Latin America, the medical professionals in this country are trained less in the understandings of structural problems such as patriarchy and racism, not to mention the expensive and profoundly troubling marketization of healthcare, and real change in this context does not seem to be imminent. Present company excluded, of course. Only in a few isolated and poorly funded, I'm sorry, I think I already said that, okay. Now, Dr. Breilh tells us that the structural differences that create health gaps are not only a social relation where the existence and the reproduction of ever-concentrating wealth depends on the existence of poorness. It's also a set of social relations that produce and reproduce poverty for increasing numbers of people while creating the image of wealth and abundance for all. These other social relations and imaginaries render the impoverished invisible or worse, conceived as impossible exceptions in a seemingly healthier world. Not surprisingly, then, the approach that Dr. Breilh proposes here is one of a radicalization of our thinking, our actions, and our underlying democracy. And to me, this appears very much as a manifestation of a key element in political ecological analysis. So what is political ecology as an approach? What am I claiming here? Well, we tend to start with resource users and their social relations in and around conflicts over resources and the environment. We then expand these to locate them in larger political economic contexts and situate the problems and conflicts in trajectories of relational history. Similarly, this talk demonstrated many commonalities with political ecology. Dr. Breilh demonstrated how the domain of the applied is the domain of the political. And that domain is what is on the ground in the everyday and therefore needs to be researched. And for all the hierarchy implied or imposed in the valuation of the kinds of research that we all do, with theory at the top and the applied sitting at the bottom, is in fact a poverty of reflection on the grounded experiences of people's health in everyday life that contributes to the poverty of theory and practice. So, in political ecology, the identification of the origins of a problem, in this case the ways that impoverished people are excluded from appropriate health care, and the construction of a relational history of the problem in its present iteration, through what social relations has this trajectory of exclusionary healthcare developed over time, and what have been the underlying conditions of its power. His first example takes us away from the idea of the health gap and acting upon it as an inevitable object of improvement thinking. Improvement thinking is an idea of development. He shifts us to an idea of the shifting structural conditions that have continually produced that gap. And it is there that lies the potential for change in the structural conditions and their relational histories, rather than in taking the gap outside the complex context within which it's been formed. As he puts it, the need for transformative research on the social determination of health, and including class, gender, and ethnic relations. Social medicine or critical epidemiology is not linear. This comes across loud and clear in his story about how critical epidemiology flourished in various forms in revolutionary periods of history, both in anti-colonial struggles, in struggles against an oligarchic state, in struggles against neoliberal capitalism today. These periods were short periods in different centuries from the 17th to the 21st, but that shows that the path of and to critical epidemiology is not linear, not static, not circular. Again, similarly to political ecology, we're implored to not just look at decontextualized factors and variables, as Amani also talked about, but at processes that are subject to change over time and across sites and bodies. We're implored to study the multiscalar, be politically aware of inequality and of multiple iterations of injustice. Now, Dr. Breilh emphasized not just poverty and wealth, health and illness, but the acceleration of economic accumulation as fundamental to creating the conditions for differentiated experience of illness and health. That acceleration consists of, as he showed us, the capital convergence for productivist, greedy uses of technologies, dispossession as appropriation and concentration of life goods, such as land, water, genomes, and general biota, and shock, the opportunistic exploitation of disasters, pandemics, and fear. And it results in extractivism being a health hazard, a destructive process, and not just a risk. So recently, political ecologists have also been looking at extractivism and looking beyond extractivism to note that even production is extractive, as I think in Dr. Breilh's talk he emphasized. And whether it's forest products or oil palm or gold mining or rubber plantations, the impoverishment of human beings and of their environments has come to be accepted as the new normal. Rector Breilh not only unpacks these issues, but shows us also that there are alternatives. He demands that we understand difference in the many built and socio-natural environments of our times. It is a radical declaration that the worse we treat our environments, the worse we are treating ourselves. Agribusiness, the monoculturalization of the world, the plantation-scene, as some people refer to it, and as one of the citations on his slides stated, from the rent of the land to the rent of life. So what then are the original contributions of Latin American critical health theory, he asks? Well, I think one here is the putting of the human before the body, and the grounded and positioned experiences of people before the abstraction of their bodily mechanics and systems. Another is the willingness to promote a radical vision of health, to put the challenge to reductionism out front, and to promote complexity in fields that are built on reductionism and abstraction and positivism, while claiming to be grounded in the critical thinking of a mainstream science sort of way. Again, many of Dr. Breilh's slides tell us what a political ecology approach to health would do, from the materialities of environments and the bodies in them, the social and political processes that make use of them, or come to be embodied by them. He emphasizes the situatedness of not only knowledges, but of practices and of power. What I love about these concepts, this model of critical epidemiology, is that it is so grounded. It shows the power of applied research, the ability to do critical thinking and engaged research together with critically engaged action. He tells us we have to have an agenda in order to have a transformative science. This project then, like political ecology as a field, is one which seeks radical change, radical transformations in our ways of thinking about and being in the world. In the health domain, the potential for radicalization and for working together seems to be so much greater than in so many other domains. Yet even in these fields, we are stuck in individualistic, commodified, profit-driven institutions, ideologies, and practices that match the neoliberal political economies dominating the world today. I see the critical interventions being suggested by Rector Breilh as having revolutionary potential not only at the institutional level, but more importantly at the level of everyday practice and life. And in the academy, that in itself is radical. So I had some questions to raise, but Dr. Breilh was very tricky. He changed his talk just enough so that my questions would not be relevant. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
In the interest of time, what I think I would like to do is to see if we could take a whole bunch of comments and interventions, which then we'll place in the hands of our wonderful presenters at the same time, so that we get as many of the interventions from our amazingly faithful audience members as possible. So I will just simply, and please, speak in as short as you can and as clear, and I'll try to call you precisely in the order in which I actually want to see you. So.
question that I asked at APHA because it's something that I've been thinking about, and I'd love your thoughts on it. But basically, I think it's telling we're doing this in an anthropology department, and I do so much work in public health and public health programs, and you're doing work in public health. And I'd be interested to know what strategies could you give us for getting these sorts of ideas, this kind of rich theoretical toolbox that I think people like Dr. Nuru-Jeter is doing in schools of public health right now. But how do we bring these kind of rich critical theories into public health in a way that is strategic and planned and thoughtful? Thank you.
Heather?
I have a question that kind of flows nicely from my colleague's question. I've been thinking about how medicine is kind of the essence of the reductionist. Driving with my kids this morning, I was distracting them by naming all the specialists, and they were just laughing because the names of, ophthalmologists, like there's just crazy things, right? So health must be whole. I'm an epidemiologist, and what I take from what you say is almost that I'm in the wrong field, that I have to be in the field of the politics. And so I'm wondering kind of how public health fits in when we're talking about deep social change, and how to vision that, but also how to actualize that.
That's great. It's clear that our audience members were thinking quite a bit as they were listening to these wonderful interventions. Please, a couple more maybe?
I would like to ask you my professor's question. I had the opportunity to approach to Latin American social medicine and political health, thanks to my professors, not through the MPH, like through public health school here in the US. And I'm from Latin America, which is very interesting. To be able to approach to these, like, just at this point of my, I guess, career. With this approach, I felt there must be something else that I can do as a student. I'm almost like ready to graduate, but I'm TAing too. I'm TAing for one class, and sometimes I feel like public health itself doesn't really give the power to the individual to change what's happening. Just like we accept what's happening, and with what I've learned from Latin American social medicine and public health and collective health, it's like, yeah, no, we have the power. Like this can be like an approach that could give us like como una idea emancipadora, como un poder emancipador al individuo. And I wonder, since you are a professor and a director of the university, what are the strategies that you see we could give the students, like as individuals, or people like who are starting their careers, to start changing things for them and by them? I don't know, I think it's just like a very broad question, but it's like the need that I feel as a student. Sometimes we just don't feel that power.
I think there was one more hand I saw back here.
I have one, but if there's
I think that's...
thank you all for your presentations. They provoked much thought. I'm sure I'm going to have more thoughts later. I'm interested in how, in your work, in all of your work, and then just thinking about the work of the future, you talk about interculturality, Dr. Breilh. You talk about interculturality and transformative health science. What are we doing now that works to incorporate indigenous knowledge, indigenous health knowledge, non-medical health knowledge, and knowledge production into spaces like this? What are we doing, and if we're not doing anything about it, what can we do within the fields of public health and epidemiology and anthropology? So maybe you could speak a little more to that.
And I guess with the fifth question, I'll recognize myself. So perhaps if we say that maybe U.S. critical thinking about inequities in health might be in some ways decades behind Latin America, where that's been central, is critical thinking in public health decades behind political now we turn it over to you, and you got all those. We got those 5 questions and 3 wonderful folks. Please have at it.
So the first question, I'm not answering the first question, I'm just restating the first question to start us off. So the first question asked about, it was Mike, asking about strategies for bringing kind of the richness of these theories that you presented into public health, especially as a president of a university. You've probably seen a lot that is probably not typical of a lot of universities in the United States. So I'm just restating and directing that towards you because I think you probably have a lot more expertise at that than we do.
You really want me to talk? I would prefer to listen to you.
You came for
I'm
a
fascinated to
long
listen
distance.
to you. I think that all these questions are absolutely relevant, are very important because they are the key questions for this relation between what we have been advocating for, which is think critically, but think critically not because we are purely thinkers. Mm-hmm. We are doers, and if we are not doers, we cannot be thinkers. There's an interdependency. So I don't have a systematized answer for all these complex questions, but I would say that, in broadly speaking, I think that many of the systematizations that we have made in our teams are a product of practice. They were not built in the lab. They were not built in the desk. Or in the classroom. They were built in the practical struggle, and that's where we needed things for that practice. I would say that first. In my process, first it was working with the chemical workers in the city, then the cut flower workers, and now with the agroecological producers. So when you ask how to apply this theory in public health, I would say in collective health, not only in public health. Let me give you an example. We have a master's course in epidemiology. And this master's course, right in the moment of the worst moment of the war against the previous president, supposedly revolutionary, we had 45 students that were all public servants of the Ministry of Health, epidemiologists of different sections of the country. And when the government, when they came, they're going to have a scholarship that was provided by the government for them to study, because the government had asked us to implement this epidemiological for training that they needed for the epidemiologists. So they came to the university and they started living all these and their projects and start working and when the government said we're not going to give you the scholarships because the president ordered nothing to do with that university, which was the war started. They said, we are going to stay in the program. And when sometime we had to go to the street to protest, when they were trying to close the university, they were marching, and they were members of the government that they were marching against. What does that show you? They wouldn't have done that if they wouldn't have tools for their action, if they would have been clarified about many of the problems they were facing in the coast, in the Andes, and wherever they worked. They knew that this was providing tools for thinking, for operating, because we never have been theoricists. I think that all this is linked to action. And when I speak about the 4 S's, that's what we're exactly doing with the banana producers. And when we're speaking about this interculturality, we're thinking about how rich it has been for us to learn and listen to what the people already know how to do, and we don't need to reinvent things that are absolutely strong with the people. So, but these are all practical things that you don't learn in the classroom. They're things that you learn in the University of Life, and that's no, I don't know. That's not a decent answer, but so the student doesn't have power. So if you give him the tools for change, and how is he going to operate? that question every one of us has asked. Probably, I don't know what you have to face probably in this university, no, but many of us have had to build in a very tortuous road the way to survive in an academy that is profoundly reactionary. So, and we don't have the power either. The only power that we get, or that we como se dice, presta, that we can borrow, is the power of the people. Because when we are engaged with communities, they protect us when we are endangered. And I think that's more of the reasons, because this has to be profoundly embedded in a community-based process. Knowledge, understanding processes, and operating. No? I think it's a very practical answer.
And if I could just add to that, I think that So the thing that came to mind initially when you asked your question, and I think it's consistent with what you're talking about, is that kind of a lot of it came from practice. But what immediately came to my mind as kind of a strategy that's not typically used in schools of public health is what I see professors such as Dr. Jason Corburn doing in city planning, which is using studio and design and kind of action-oriented projects as a strategy for education, as opposed to come to class and listen to me lecture. Get out there in the communities and work on this project, and inherently you will learn, right? When we think about the work that our joint medical program does here, it's different. They're not out in communities, but they're not learning from traditional didactic lecturing and education. They're given cases because this is what you're going to face in the real world. Now go figure it out, right? And so I do think that there's a lot of room for transformative and more innovative educational practices in U.S. schools of public health. I would also say to the last comment, you said public health is not giving the power to individuals to change. They just accept it. And so my initial gut reaction was we shouldn't be giving you the power. That power has to come from within. And when you are unsatisfied, unfulfilled with the state of how things are, you will be motivated to act. And I feel like the greatest changes and kind of sources of activism, at least in our School of Public Health, have been generated by the students, because they've said, you are not training us to go out there and tackle the world that we live in today. We are no longer comfortable with the status quo. And it was through that activism that people started listening and things really started to change. And so I really think that fire is within all of us. And yes, there are tools that we all need to learn. And I think we can figure out what are those different strategies to do that. We can borrow from the expertise of other places, but I just want to encourage you, but also all of you and all of us, to not be okay with the status quo, to feel comfortable pushing back. That's what critical thinking is all about, right? It's about, not accepting kind of the kind of narrative, those master narratives of the powers that be, and kind of pushing back against that. And just one last comment: am I in the wrong field? Is epidemiology the wrong field? I inherently say no. So I'm not trained as an epidemiologist. I have kind of an interdisciplinary, kind of a varied background. But I think that from this presentation, as a health policy person, I could say, am I in the wrong field? As a biologist, I could say, am I in the wrong field? As someone who works in maternal and child health, I could say, am I in the wrong field? But I think when I was introduced, Dr. Briggs mentioned that I was an RWJ Health and Society Scholar. And the whole goal of that program was to really create interdisciplinary and really foster interdisciplinary critical thinking. And the objective of that program was to train people in public health and sociology and psychology and political science to kind of learn this kind of new interdisciplinary way of thinking, and to go back and infect all of the places that we all came from. So then it's not about what's my home discipline, it's about whatever discipline I'm in, I can carry that with me. And so my hope is that as someone who's a social epidemiologist now, and I said before that I think there are a lot of similarities, and I do, but I still do think that there is a divide, because I don't think that North American epidemiology is where Latin American critical epidemiology is, and the fundamental fundamental divide that I see is that action step, the second part of the definition of epidemiology, right? And so my hope for epidemiology, but even what we call in North America social epidemiology, because there is a range of people who would be at the more critical end of the spectrum, but those that are still at the more conservative end of the spectrum, that we can actually change the field of epidemiology. So we don't any longer need to say social epidemiology, that is our habitus, right? And so I would say stay where you are, because the world needs all of us doing the same thing in all of our different places.
Great. Oh, God.
Absolutely. Just one more little thing. If you want, oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I'm
you
sorry.
go ahead, please. No, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry.
I only had to come across
one
the
thing connecting with, I fully agree what I've heard from both Dr. Peluso and Dr. Nuru-Jeter. I think that one thing I was telling some friend this morning, that the first class in my doctoral program is said, look, I am a calm person. I am friendly. I don't like the teachers that are authoritarian and that are in the Olymp, like a god that you cannot have access to. I'm completely. But one thing that can kill me and I can become a monster is when I see negative competitiveness between students, like reproducing the individualist philosophy of the society, And I say, you have to cooperate. You have to learn to really respect your mates and really learn from them. Because if you don't do that, and you don't do that in home, and you don't do that with your mates, and you don't do that in the community, then you're not going to struggle for health and for justice. You're going to be an individualist idiot. So I was surprised. One of the students in my first doctoral group had a very difficult economical situation and couldn't pay a second tuition that had to be paid. You know what they did? They made a collect between all the rest of the classmates to save her life. So that's a university. That's a decent university. That's when I really celebrated. I mean, and was very proud of being part of that university. Because I think that many times when you're in PhD programs, each one is a diva or a divo, and each one is above, decimos por encima del bien y del mal. There, and that's terrible, because that's the destruction of everything that we've been saying. So this is another thing that I would add to all these important comments that were, because in our own house, in our own university, we have to be decent.
What to say? I mean, I guess what you raised the question of political ecology and which might have come first, that or critical epidemiology. Well, there's certainly no question about it that the Latin American scholars in the social sciences, I think, have long been far and away more critical than any other part of the world. If you think about, as they say, back in the day when I was in graduate school, everybody we studied was working on Latin American politics or was a Latin American political sociologist and developing, in fact, both theory and practice. Mm-hmm. It's the home of where liberation theology probably had its greatest impact, and other kinds of, what's the word? Not existential, but kind of practical learning, and I think what you've been talking about with the kind of hierarchies that we have among graduate students as well as among professors and among fields, and which of those things are the ones that predominantly value scholar activism or activist scholarism versus those that value the theoretical. It's disheartening to kind of see how those hierarchies are made. So I really appreciate, here we have the rector of one of the most progressive universities in Latin America, sitting down at the table, chatting about this with students and faculty from here, and it's just a perfect example of how far along you guys are.
What
So
about
thank
environmental
you.
thinking? I mean, in
Environmental
terms
thinking.
of the, I think that's more a recent phenomenon of really focusing on the environment. Right?
In epidemiology.
In critical epidemiology,
Sure.
where it's central now, but it's kind of like North America with health social determinations with health inequities, and now that's become central. But
And
recently,
Charles, I just want to remind you that technically this already ended.
okay, so what about with regard to the environment, right?
With
In some
regard,
sense,
what in regard to the environment?
critical epidemiology, in some sense, trying to assimilate the environment and environmental degradation as a central focus of study.
Well, okay, if you're thinking about, for example, if you're thinking about environmental understandings, or let's say environmental studies or environmental justice studies have very much centered around health and toxic environments and that kind of thing. Whereas the other kinds of environmental circumstances, I mean, I think you were doing a combination of things. You're talking about the pesticides and the health effects of that in these different kinds of environments, but that's completely grounded in, unlike many environmental justice stories, the concentration of land, the kind of filling in the materialities of these different resources and how they affect what's going on. I don't know which came first. It's like a chicken and egg kind of question, but I think what's interesting is that there's traffic between all of these different kinds of approaches, and that there's a productive traffic, and I think as long as we're not stuck in our own little disciplinary boxes or interdisciplinary boxes, that's the key.
Well, what a wonderful model we've seen today, precisely of that sort of generous, interdisciplinary, critical,
transdisciplinary.
Trans. So thank you so much to our speakers for your generosity.
Oh, thank you.
There's a lot of
It was an honor to be here. My goodness.
Likewise.